Kerri Schatz is a longtime PhoneGap Cordova community member. If you've actually ever asked for help sometime on the PhoneGap forums, Kerri has probably helped you.
That's true.
And yes, it is very true. And if she hasn't helped you, then she's helped get the answer to somebody who has helped you. So I think we're all basically like within maybe not even 6 degrees, but 3 degrees of Kerri Schatz. And just recently, she's moved to New York to work at Adobe as well. So I'm super happy to present Kerri Schatz.
Okay. So thank you, Simon, for that excellent, wonderful introduction. And so, yeah, I've been here for like 2 months now, like 4th paycheck into Adobe, so this is all very new to me. But I'm very excited to be working at Adobe and doing all this stuff. And I'm also very excited to bring modern JavaScript and PhoneGap to you and how you can use that to use modern ES5, ES6, ES 2017, 2018, and so on as JavaScript evolves. So I've used PhoneGap for quite a while, 6 years. I've written about 5 books about PhoneGap. I am a committer on the Apache Cordova project, and I am one of many moderators on either the Google group or the PhoneGap Adobe forums. So if you haven't been to the PhoneGap Adobe forums, please stop by. If you can contribute, that would be excellent. We can always use more contributors, but if you have questions, there's lots of us that are looking at the forums to see if we can help you or guide you to the right people who can. And like I just said, I just started at Adobe, so I'm still figuring everything out in terms of layouts and buildings and fun things like that. So I'm a sci-fi person. I like Doctor Who and Star Trek and stuff like that. So I thought that we'd take a brief step back in time. And so if you know Doctor Who, you'll recognize the TARDIS. And it's going to be remarkably well behaved for us today because it's going to go in sequential order. But back in 2009, I don't know how many of you remember, this is what we had as far as what an iPhone looked like. The iPhone 3GS had just come out. And this is what iOS 3 looked like in all its skeuomorphic glory. And we also, as far as Android went, we had the HTC Hero. And this is what Android 1.5 looked like. And in both of these cases, they supported ES3. So ES3 was standardized back in 1999. ES3 was great, but it was lacking a lot of, obviously, modern features. So JS5 was finally standardized. And this is the version hopefully we all know and love-ish. We got use strict, we got map, reduce, object create, all these fun things, JSON parsing. And right now it's supported by all modern web views, except in 2009, no one supported it. So it wasn't really until much later that we were actually able to use all these cool features. So 2012 comes along, and we get the iPhone 5. And iOS 6, still skeuomorphic as all get out, but we get 93%, finally 93% support for ES5, so we can start using all those things in the mobile world. And Samsung Galaxy S3 is an example of an Android phone at the time, and we had Android 4.1, which had a little bit less support for ES5, but still, good enough to actually use. And come to 2015, and ES 2015, or ES6, as it was originally known, is born. And iOS 9 came out, and this was 54% support for ES 2015, which is a change from back when the previous version came out and no one supported it for like 3 years. So we were able to start using these features pretty quickly. Android 5.1 was not quite as well supported. But there's a lot of new changes in ES 2015 or ES6. It had been a long, long time since we had an update. So there was a lot of important new features. We got block scoped let and const, destructuring named parameters, arrow functions, symbols, maps, all sorts of fun things. I'm going to share with you a few examples. I'm not going to go into all the depth of this, but I do have a link at the end that will give you some resources in terms of places that you can go look up if you really want to delve deep into what ES 2015 is all about. So 2016 came along and iOS 10, so a year after ES 2015, the standard is released, we have 100% support in a mobile browser. There is a catch to that, and we'll get to it a little bit later. So we only had to really wait just about a year before we could use all of the ES 2015 features. And the same was virtually true with Android. So 2016 came along, and the important thing to remember with modern JavaScript is it's now going to be on a yearly release cycle. So ES 2015, it had been a long time, so there was a lot included in the language. Come ES 2016, it had only been a year. So the list of new features is much shorter. So we got the exponent operator, and we got array prototype includes, which is quite nice. And so I would expect this to continue going forward. The list of features will be smaller and more digestible each year we go along. 2017 brought about ES 2017, which gave us async await. Yes. String padding, shared memory, atomics, all sorts of really cool features that you can use in your apps. What about 2018? So we're the TARDIS. We can look into the future a little bit. And so there's all sorts of cool things coming up. One thing that's pretty much for sure is some revisions to the template literals, which I will show you in a little bit. But there's all these stage 3 proposals out there. And so the process is on a 4-stage process. Stage 3 means it's getting pretty close to being finalized. It's not there yet, so it may not make it into ES 2018. It might make it in ES 2019 or something. But all of these very interesting features, global, regular expression improvements, finally on promises, class fields, which I'm a big fan of, and all these very interesting things. So if you want to be involved in the discussion or just kind of track what's going on, there's a couple of very good sites that I would point you to. esdiscuss.org is really a prettier representation of the second link there. And it shows you the mailing list and all the discussions going back and forth with all the members as to maybe proposing new features, discussing existing features, saying why this will or will not work. And the bottom link is to all the proposed new features, and you can read through the specifications and the strawman and everything like that. So if you're not familiar with ES 2015 and above, I'm going to give you a quick intro. I'm excited that we finally have block scoped variables. Finally. The number of times that I have been caught out by misusing var by accident boggles my mind. If I had a nickel, I would be rich. So I'm very ecstatic that we finally have const and let. And again, continuing my doctor theme, you can see at the very top we have 2 constants, number of doctors 13. My doctor was David Tennant. And the important thing to recognize here is I can let I equals the number of doctors and then iterate over that. But because it's scoped, the internal I does not affect the external I. But there's an important feature with const. It sounds like maybe it should be immutable, but it's not. It just means that the reference will not change. So I can go into an object and explicitly change values inside that object, and JavaScript will not complain. So, and the same thing applies to arrays. So that's something very important to remember, is that const does not mean immutable. So the other thing that I've always had trouble with in JavaScript is this. And you end up with .bind or .apply or who knows what all over your code. And so this is an example of where you might tend to run into problems. So down at the bottom, I just have an add event listener to a button. The button is going to say hi to K9. If you're familiar with Doctor Who, that's one of his companions. And I just use this .say hi, which is a problem because then I get this. Undefined is not an object because when I click the button, the context is not what I expected it to be. So with ES 2015, we got arrow functions. In a way, you can say this kind of solves this problem, but if you really want to look at it, it just adds another thing to be aware of when it comes to understanding this. Arrow functions are lexically scoped, so this will come from the object in which you're defining the function. So here, when I have my add event listener and I say pass the event, this will be passed through to my say hi, which means I will actually get hello K9, I'm the doctor. So very useful things. They are not drop-in replacements for regular functions, so you do have to understand the difference. You just can't use them everywhere. But when you want to use the this in the lexical scope, they're a great way to go. There are some quirks with arrow functions. They are very terse, so it might take a little bit to get over the initial reading of an arrow function. So if you have 0 or 2 parameters, arrow functions require that you use parentheses around either none or 2 or more. And that's what the first 2 examples are showing. If you have 1 parameter, JavaScript won't complain if you go ahead and use parentheses around the parameter. The convention tends to be not to use those parentheses. That's a styling issue that you and your team can decide. It just makes it look a little bit cleaner. If you have a lot of parentheses, try and group all those together. And if you happen to only need the second parameter, just a comma on its own isn't going to work, so use some dummy variable like underscore. Single line arrow functions use an implicit return, so you won't see the return token there, which makes them extremely concise, but it does require a little bit of rewiring to say, oh, yes, this function is going to return a value. If you want to do an explicit return, you have to use the block form, and the two do not mix. So if you try to use a return with the single line form, ES 2015 will complain at you. So, and if you don't use return here in the block form, you'll return undefined. And unfortunately, there comes some ambiguity. So what if I wanted to return an object? This will fail because the JavaScript parser actually renders it this way. So I becomes a label, and we actually return nothing. We return undefined. So if you're returning just an object inside of an arrow function, wrap it in parentheses, which I'll admit, every time that I do this, it still catches me out. So I tend to just prefer, if I'm going to return an object, I'm going to use the block form. It's explicit. I don't have to do any crazy wrapping of of the object. And to me, it's easier to read the block form when it comes to objects. So another feature that I have really fallen in love with ES 2015, and I've fallen in love with most of them, so you'll hear me say that a lot, is template literals. And these give us the option to have like multi-line strings, finally, but it also gives us the ability to interpolate expressions. So if in say hello and goodbye, for example, the $, curly braces, will use what's inside as to interpolate that string. So in this case, if I say hello and goodbye doctor, I get hello doctor, goodbye doctor. And when you're using the multi-line strings, it's important to remember that it is keeping track of the white space. So that's why the indentation here looks a little bit funny. Had I indented that, then this goodbye doctor would have been indented over as well. Now you can use arbitrary expressions inside your template literals. So it looks cool and it's fun to begin with. Use with care, because although this example is not terribly difficult to understand and parse, you can make a super complicated template literal that is impossible to understand. I mean, you can go so far as nesting template literals, yeah, don't do that. So it's a cool feature. It's nice that it's there for those moments when you absolutely have to, but yeah, try to avoid going too deep. The other nice thing with arrow functions is if you're familiar with promises, things get a little bit more concise. So you don't have to keep typing new promise, resolve, reject. You can use an arrow function here, which is really handy. And chaining gets easier to read with these arrow functions as well. So here I have get position, which is going to return a geolocation position to me. I can just use the dot, then it's easy to read, as is the dot catch. So destructuring kind of plays into all of this. I'm using it in terms of template literals, but destructuring is really, really cool. The syntax is, to me, less than ideal. It can get really sharp around the edges, so again, use this with care. You can, in my function here, the let timestamp, latitude and longitude are the variables I'm extracting out of data. And if you remember the geolocation results, that's kind of the object structure you would get back, is a timestamp and then a nested data structure inside that has latitude, longitude, altitude, those kinds of things. So you can extract information from deep within inside of an object. The caveat I indicated with template literals applies here, because you can make something very unreadable very quickly if you're nesting really deeply. So consider breaking those up into smaller bits. And destructuring is not just for objects, it works for arrays as well, which is really kind of cool. But either way you do this, just remember the syntax is a little bit unexpected if you're only familiar with JavaScript, so give yourself or your team members a little bit of time to get familiar with how destructuring looks. Really cool feature. This is an ES 2017 feature, and there's a talk a little bit later on about this. But async await. So it's a way, it uses promises under the hood, but it's a way to write synchronous looking code and still be able to use try and catch and the same kind of error handling mechanisms we would use for synchronous code. The important thing to note is that async will poison the call tree. So either all the callers must be asynchronous, or you handle the return result from an async function as a promise, so .then, .catch. And another interesting feature with ES 2015 is array.from. I love this function now, or this method now. I will use it all the time whenever I possibly can, because if you've ever worked with a node list and tried to convert it into array or an arguments pseudo array to a function, you had to do stuff like slice.call, and inevitably I'm looking on Google, is it slice? Is it splice? Well, you know, all those kinds of fun things. So with ES 2015, I just say array.from, and as long as it's an array like, it will return an array. So I can just say array from document query selector, and I get my array. And it's a real array. I can map, reduce, everything. But it's also cool to create series. So as long as the object I pass to array.from has a length property, I can iterate over that and generate any kind of series that I want. So it's a very useful feature. You'll find all sorts of uses for array.from. REST is awesome. I love REST. It makes it super easy to have variable number of arguments, and it's self-documenting. Whereas before, I mean, JavaScript has always let you do variable number of arguments to a function. It just wasn't obvious. You would have to parse the arguments object and so on. But now, if in this example, if I have multiple arguments, the first one goes into start, all the other arguments are collected into nums, and it's an actual array. I don't need to do array.from on it or anything like that. And then I can just use it however I would use an array. So if you remember the destructuring example earlier, destructuring also gives us something similar. If you're familiar to other languages and named parameters, destructuring gives us kind of that functionality. So it's really useful if you have functions with a lot of arguments that you don't always want to have to worry about the position of, since with named arguments, you can specify them in any order you want. So in this example, we've got quality, width, and height as to be passed in, and I'm also providing defaults. So if I don't provide a quality or a width or a height, JavaScript will insert that value for me, which is really, really nice.
What is the last equals?
So that is a particular catch of JavaScript, and if you happen not to provide that little equal curly brace, if you don't pass any parameters at all, the destructuring will not happen. So that's actually a default of saying if I don't pass anything, you're going to get an empty object and then it fills that in. Yeah. It's the syntax is a little bit awkward, I will fully admit.
It's still a bit straightforward, though.
Yeah, but it's an amazing feature to have. So it lets me do things like this. I can call it with nothing, and I will get all the defaults. I can specify one parameter to override it. I can use height and width down there, and notice that height and width are in different orders. So the order doesn't matter, the name does. And the big thing with ES 2015 that I really, really love is finally module support. So we can do export and import, which is really excellent because it lets us do static analysis, dead code removal, those kinds of things.
Wow.
So, cool. Where can I use it? Well, right now, you can actually use a lot of this in your browser right now. As long as you're on a recent version of Android Chrome, 51 and above has almost full support for ES 2015. Edge 15 has 100% support. iOS 10.3 has full support. So you can use these features right now without any additional steps. 2016 or ES 2016 is very well supported. ES 2017 is also very well supported. And I just saw in when I was looking at the compatibility tables, Safari has some ES 2018 stuff in it already. So the browser vendors are being very forward, very progressive in terms of getting this stuff in so that you can use it as quickly as possible. But there is a catch, right? So if you are targeting older devices or you need module support, you need to use a transpiler and a bundler. So the transpiler will convert all your ES 2015 code into ES5 for older devices. And almost all, not quite, but almost all of ES 2015 can be transpiled down to ES5 using polyfills, if you look at the source code, sometimes it'll be this very complicated function that you're glad you didn't have to write. But almost everything is transpilable. There are a few things that aren't, but I haven't mentioned any of those. So. And there are various number of transpilers out there. I happen to use TypeScript. A lot of people use Babel, but there are these other options as well. And the catch is module support is problematic, right? It's part of the language, but for a long time, there was no support for it. There was no underlying implementation. It is now available in Safari and iOS. Chrome and Android WebView also has it, but it's behind a flag on Edge 15 and on Firefox. So you can't necessarily expect your users to turn on a flag in order to use an app. So what are we to do with that? The other thing that I wanted to mention is once you do have native modules, they are not quite the same as what you might be expecting from, say, with Node, where you can use require. You must specify the extension. You must specify a path. There is no module resolution. So get used to seeing a lot of relative paths everywhere. And the other important thing is when you're in the browser, it needs to know that the file that you're calling is going to use modules. So there's this new type equals module to let the browser know that you are going to use import and export. Otherwise, the browser will say, hey, I saw import, I don't know what to do with it, and nothing happens. So like I said, if you're familiar with using just require or something like that, you might try to use like a decimal with no path and expect there to be some resolution to find it. That will not happen. If you don't have an extension, it will assume that you're talking about a file with no file extension. So you do have to specify all of that if you're going to use native modules. So to get module support, we can bundle, and there are various number of options. There's Webpack, JSPM, Browserify, lots of other options out there as well. But there's an important thing to remember with bundling. Once you introduce this as a build step, you can do more than just bundle your stuff together. You can convert Sass to CSS as part of your build step. You can lint your code. You can copy and compress assets. You can get really, really inventive with your build step. You can also, once you introduce bundles, and I'm not going to tarry very long on this slide, but once you introduce bundles, you can, if you want, kind of supply one version to the older browsers, the bundle to the older browsers, and then supply the modern JavaScript to the new browsers. There's a catch with Safari 10.1, so I'll have the slides up afterwards. You might want to look into that. So if I'm going to bundle, what are my options? I could do it manually. Fine for a one-off, but at some point I'm going to forget that I didn't run the build step, and we're programmers. We like automation. So that you could use task runners, gulp, grunt, etc. I like to use npm run scripts. The commands are not difficult, and it doesn't add a lot of complexity. You can also use plugin hooks and project hooks. So I'm going to go over a quick example of how to build a Webpack plus TypeScript config for your apps. So I'm using Webpack. I'm going to use TypeScript and Babel. It's really easy to do. You just install them, configure them, and add a couple scripts to package JSON. So save npm install save dev Webpack. That's easy enough. And if you're going to do TypeScript, you need to install the TS loader, TypeScript. Core.js happens to be a polyfill for some of the ES 2015 features. Babel, if you need to install Babel loader, Babel core, and whatever presets you're intending on using. So here I'm using Babel preset env, which gets me all sorts of wonderful features, including the latest versions of ES 2016, 2017, and so on. And then I need to configure it. So the example on the left happens to be the TypeScript configuration. The example on the right is the Babel configuration. And not terribly complex. The TypeScript configuration, you do need to say allow JavaScript. Otherwise, it'll get to a JavaScript file and say, well, this isn't a TypeScript file. What are you using me for? So if you allow JavaScript, it will read that and compile it appropriately. And then you need to point it and say that the target is ES5. TypeScript can output ES 2015. It can output ES3. So you have a little bit of flexibility with regard as to what your output is going to be. And when you're doing TypeScript, make sure that you use module ES 2015. This is what will allow Webpack later to do dead code removal. And in addition, you can specify additional libraries that you're using. Be very, definitely use source maps. If you don't use source maps and you're inside your browser, you're going, and you need to debug it, you're going to be looking at generated code, which is absolutely horrible to try and debug. So you definitely want to use source maps, at least when you're developing. If you later then want to turn them off in production, that's fine, although sometimes that might hinder debugging a production bug. So you use as you find appropriate. So on the Babel side, I've got loose is true. This is just for performance reasons. It relaxes a little bit of the strictness on ES 2015 or on Babel's ES 2015 transforms. And again, modules false lets Webpack do some dead code removal. Then you need to build your Webpack config, and it's actually a fairly small configuration if you're just using like TypeScript or Babel. At some point, you're going to build, you would probably build a larger Webpack config to handle things like Sass to CSS or other build steps. But this is a fairly simple example. I'm telling it to use a source map as the dev tool. The context is telling me where my ES 2015 code lives. The entry points to my entry file. And then I'm telling it to generate a bundle.js file somewhere, which all looks well and good, but right now this does nothing because I need to tell it which loader to use to convert my code. So in this case, I'm using TS loader, which is for TypeScript, but if you're using Babel, just replace that with Babel loader. And again, I need to tell TypeScript, if that's the one I'm going to be using, that the entry file is JavaScript. Otherwise, it complains. If you're using Babel, you don't need that line. And then you can set up your npm scripts however you would like. So this is an example of where I'm initially calling Webpack in debug mode to simulate it. but I can also build it in release mode with -P production, which will minify and run dead code removal. So these are really handy if your build steps are fairly simple, but Webpack config can do an extremely a large amount of work for you. So this may be all you need in your NPM run scripts. Just wanted to call this out because at some point, especially like Core.js and other various libraries that you may be importing, they may be large. So you may want to invoke some code splitting. And in this example, I'm splitting Core.js out into a vendor file. It's really easy to do. You just add it to the entry points. So now I have 2 entry points, and I add a little plugin that says generate vendor.js. What's cool about that is, as granted, I now have 2 script files to load in my index HTML file. But what's cool is it's easier to whitelist or blacklist, say, the vendor file while I'm debugging. I don't need to debug Core.js's internals. I need to debug my internals. So I can blacklist out the Core.js in the dev tools. So there's another way you could go about this. If you don't want to build the config yourself, I've built a plugin called Webpack Transpiler. You can go use it. It will work with TypeScript, Babel, and is very configurable. And all you have to do is add it to your project. And then you can do Cordova build iOS, which will invoke the transpiler transparently to you. Cordova build iOS release will do it in release mode. And if you absolutely must skip the transform, you can do that as well. Or, and this is what I would personally suggest, if you're starting a new project, grab one of these templates. Especially the templates by Tommy DevGeeks are amazing if you need to use Vue and Framework 7. I've got a couple at the top, but they're just using vanilla JavaScript. They aren't saying any particular framework. So I did have a video. We'll see if this actually works or not. And this is just a quick, simple example of me creating a Hello World app. And I am using that template, Cordova template, Webpack, TypeScript, Sass. It's going to go do its work. You can see it's already built up all of these files for me. And then what I can do is I can run the prepare step. And you'll notice it's now doing an npm install. So it's taking care of all the dependencies for me. And it's added all this stuff to my project. And now it's also then doing bundling and transpilation. And you can see all the stuff it just took care of for you. And it's going through now and doing the regular Cordova build process. And then I can just run it. So like I can run it in the browser or run it on my device. And it will go ahead and redo the transpilation to catch any changes you've made. But you'll notice now that this is running, and it's running with ES 2015 code, which I'm going to show you in a second. So this Webpack, this is from the source map. And so you can see over on the right, it's a little small, but you can see over on the right that I've got some ES 2015 stuff in there. I've got like let and things like that going on. But what's actually being run is this bundled JavaScript file. And if I look at that, you can tell there's a lot more that's been inserted. So this is why you don't want to have to debug this kind of a file. So use source maps whenever you can. If I can get rid of this. Okay. And I lost my presentation, didn't I? There we go. So an important reality check. ES 2015 is still new. And even though, it's been out there for a little while, it is not guaranteed to be as fast as the ES5 equivalent. So if you're upgrading just to see performance, don't. Upgrade for other reasons, for the less boilerplate, upgrade for easier coding, upgrade for arrow functions, modules, whatever. But don't do it just solely because of performance. because while there are some things that perform identically, some things perform much slower, and then there are a few things that perform a lot faster. Interestingly enough, ES 2015, I wanted to give you a rough example in terms of performance across various kinds of devices. So on my MacBook Pro, the one I have here, or an iPad Pro, it's really, really fast. You won't have any problem using it. iPhone 6s is a little bit slower. iPad Mini 4 is probably about 2 times slower. And then you get into the Android devices, which I've seen slowdowns of upwards of like 30 times, but these are fairly old devices. So if you can get something nice and smooth on these old devices, you're probably set for everything else. Now the catch is, I'm using WK WebView for this. If you use UI WebView on iOS, you're never going to know exactly where you're going to end up, because depending upon the language feature that you're using, UI WebView may be just as fast as WK WebView, give or take, or it may be really, really slow. So my suggestion is, if you can use WK WebView in iOS, do so. Plus you get advantage to the just-in-time compiler and all of those kinds of things. So just a few more reality checks. I'm trying to ruin my talk here, right? You're going to have a build step if you're going to do transpilation and those kinds of things. Even though we have source maps, and that's excellent, debugging can be a little bit fun sometimes. And some of the syntax is a little sharp, so handle that with care. If you're working in a team, understand that it might take a little bit of time for some of your team members to ramp up on what that syntax actually means. So I'm crushing your dreams. But the important thing here to note is micro benchmarks, which is what those performance things from earlier are not the entire story, because they don't always reflect the real world. Furthermore, engines are continually evolving and improving, so I would fully expect that there are features in ES 2015 where it should be faster than ES5 at some point. And there's lots of benefits. So don't make performance the only reason, because ES 2015 and above can be expressive, concise, less boilerplate, and you get all sorts of nice language features, modules, template literals. If you're a class person, you get classes. There's a reason why I left that out, because that part's very controversial. So some tips. Don't think that you have to transition your entire app into ES 2015 right off the bat. ES5 still works. It's a valid target. And as far as the example of transpilation, you're probably going to be pushing to ES5 a lot. So just use ES 2015 when you're ready, as needed, when it makes sense. You can adopt it slowly. I mean, if you want to, you can adopt it quickly, but I would suggest just starting out with some of the simpler features and going from there. When it comes to block scoped variables, let and const are great, but var has not gone away. You may not see it as often, but there are cases, for example, tight nested loops, where var will still outperform your block scoped variables. And the other important thing to remember is arrow functions, and I'm repeating myself from earlier, arrow functions are not drop-in. So if you've got an arrow function or a reference to an arrow function, do not assume that it will work everywhere a normal function would work. Minify, remove dead code. If you use the Webpack configuration or the plugins that I mentioned, you will get that for free in your release. The one thing I do want to mention with dead code removal is if you do imports that have side effects, but then you don't actually reference that variable anymore, sometimes a dead code removal can be a little overly aggressive and remove that out because it didn't see you actually using it. So be careful with that a little bit. Split your code bundles. The vendor code can be separately bundled. It's easier to blacklist in your debugger. And on iOS, use WK WebView if you can. So there's a lot of resources you can use to learn modern JavaScript, and these are all sites that I used to learn it myself. I would especially point out Tuality if you want really deep, in-depth discussions of all the ins and outs of how ES 2015 and beyond works. He goes really in-depth into some of the things that you might not have otherwise considered, the edge cases, the gotchas, all of those important things. So thank you That's using modern JavaScript and PhoneGap.